You got a Christmas joke?
Yeah, I got some good ones. What's an elf's favourite music? Rap.
Okay. At the start, I know. So this is what I wanted to say. You started talking for too long. So you just went straight into the serious business.
Hi, I'm Jared Ball. I'm the Chief Economist at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and I'm here with our Chief Executive, Melinda Salento, for Economist's Corner. Great chance to have a chat about what's going on in the economy and the policy world at the moment. Melinda, I thought today I might start off with 2020 is a really interesting year, and people have long used it as kind of an anchor for long-term forecasts about what's going to happen in the world and some of the technological advances that we see. It's a lot easier to predict just a year ahead and think about what might be the key kind of issues that are going to dominate the debate in 2020. Globally at the moment, we've got the US election coming up at the end of next year. We've got the issues around Brexit. There has been some signs that perhaps the US-China tensions might at least stop escalating as opposed to actually being resolved. But how do you see the global environment at the moment, and is that giving any inspiration to business and others in Australia at the moment about the environment that we're operating in?
Yeah, well, I think when you look around and have a look at the key issues for 2020, geopolitically and globally, everyone's talking US-China. Now, US is even more complicated. We've got the impeachment process going on, obviously, and we've got elections next year. So what happens with the US-China relationship, who knows? One likely scenario, or one possible scenario, is that President Trump just goes a bit slow, doesn't want to antagonise those trade relationships in an election year, given the potential impact on the stock market and economic outlook. So I just think there doesn't seem to be a lot of upside. If anything, maybe a pause, but globally, all the risks still seem very much to the downside, and it looks like a pretty flat year. Some are calling for growth to be the slowest since we've seen since the GFC.
And I think when you talk about the US, one of the interesting things so far has been how resilient the consumer has been there. 70% of their economy, and it actually has helped to hold things up. Here in Australia, on the other hand, this has really been our Achilles heel over recent years. Consumption just hasn't come back, and we're really relying on a lot of public demand. And certainly yesterday's national accounts, some are calling it, perhaps the start of the gentle upturn, but it still seems that, most of our economic activity is being driven by a few things, public demand and infrastructure, a big part of it, but also, sectors linked to our lower Aussie dollar, like tourism and education. What do you think about Australia in 2020? Is a lot of people predicting 2021 is suddenly going to be the year that things pick up? What are we looking for in terms of a spark in 2020 to see that things might be, getting better?
Yeah, again, really hard to see from my perspective. Interested to know what you think as well. Where the spark for a big tick up in activity comes from. Consumers still pretty subdued here. If anything, consumption growth still slowing. The housing sector, we've seen recovery in prices, but dwelling construction, which is what drives economic activity, is still on the way down. So, and of course, business confidence, stabilising, but still below average. So, in a world of uncertainty, even with low interest rates, unless we get to a point where business just says, hang it, we're now used to living with this level of uncertainty and we've just got to start making investments, it's hard to see where that spark comes from.
No, I think that's right, and I think a lot of us will be looking carefully at business investment in 2020 to see if there is any signs of life there, and I think also we've seen productivity is really down now, despite the fact that it seems that a lot of the growth in employment has been in business services and people trying to implement new technology. we're not seeing that. So this all points towards the need to look long-term, the need to look at structural reform and building productive capacity in our economy. There's going to be some pretty interesting issues, I think, at play in Australia in 2020 to that issue. One of them being ageing, and I think 2020 is an interesting year. I was reading the other day that it's going to be the first year that there'll be more people on Earth aged above 30 than under 30 for the first time. And there's a real need for us to be less inclined towards, retirement being a bit of a cliff as opposed to a kind of gentle ramp, and kind of changing our sense of how the life cycle works. Here in Australia, we're going to have the intergenerational report in the first part of the year. Then we've got the Aged Care Royal Commission. It does feel like it might be a big year in terms of starting to perhaps grapple with some of those issues around our ageing population. What do you think about some of those developments in 2020?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that at CEDA's annual dinner, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg put ageing front and centre, copped a bit of criticism for it, and how he represented it in the paper the next day, which was interesting because actually workforce participation for older workers has been rising. It's one of the things that's a standout feature of what's happening in our labour force at the moment. So in many ways, older people are already making that transition for a whole range of reasons. But how we've grappled with it systemically and through policy, we probably haven't made the progress that we need to see there. And I think the big question for 2020, when we get the Aged Care Royal Commission report, when we get the intergenerational report, is are we now going to start to see some really serious policy commitments and some really serious policy implementation? Because a lot of these issues have been talked about for a long time. I think the first intergenerational report was 2002, if I'm correct. We really actually now need to be grappling with these issues, what it means not just for essential services, which really matter to the community. We saw that in our Community Pulse results from 2018. We'll have another look at that in 2020. But they matter for the community, they matter for our economy, and increasingly they're going to matter for businesses in terms of getting the skills and the workforce that they need.
Another area that's been prominent, certainly it was a part of Daniel Andrews' State of the State speech this week to CEDA, is mental health, and the Productivity Commission will report in 2020 on mental health. And one of their early kind of findings is that we simply can't afford to treat mental health in the same way that we've been treating physical health, and there's a need for prevention there, and also some interesting suggestions around having more kind of regional models of funding. These are all pointing to issues where we need to think very differently about how we implement policy and programs. So I think that's going to be an interesting area that develops over 2020 as well.
Look, again, another really critical issue. It's not an issue just confronting Australia, but the rest of the world. Again, mental health, talked about for a while. If you have a look at the Royal Commission here in Victoria into mental health services, the issues that they raised have been, to be honest, reasonably well known, and they're things that we've picked up in our entrenched disadvantage work, disrupting disadvantage. Fragmented services, siloed services, lack of long-term funding, lack of intervention, early intervention and preventative measures. Right, this is known. This has been known across human services delivery for some time. Again, we've got to start getting on with this stuff and making serious inroads, and it's got to involve collaboration with business to understand, in a mental health sense, what can be done in the workplace, and from a government perspective, how we can better deliver services to get across these issues. The figures are startling. The link between mental health and entrenched disadvantage, incarceration rates, the number of people in prisons who have serious mental health issues, we really need to see some progress.
Yeah, I think that's right, and we need to, and this is a real message for the intergenerational report next year, kind of start to look out and get ahead of issues. And I know the 2015 report did not mention mental health once, yet it's a $16 billion cost to governments. So
Jared, we've talked a bit about a sort of global and domestic economic outlook, and in a sense, a lot of the challenges before us. What about some of the opportunities?
Yeah, I think there's certainly still plenty of long-term opportunities, and one of the issues that we've been doing a lot of thinking around here is data. And obviously, great promise in terms of unlocking some productivity, better outcomes for consumers, and certainly there's a lot of activity looking at the legislative frameworks. But stepping back from that a little bit and just saying, have we got everything that we need in Australia in terms of our workforce and in terms of, just community awareness around data and data literacy to really make the most of that opportunity, which I think in a low productivity environment is really important. And so to that end, that's the first project that we're going to be looking at in 2020. So I think a big opportunity there. One of the interesting kind of opportunities that I've seen in the last little while, and it aligns well with some of the work we've done at CEDA, is around workforce and the fact that we're now, it seems the federal government is taking a bit of focus on workplace collaboration. What do you make of that, Melinda?
I think it's a really positive development. I think it's very difficult to have conversations in this country around industrial relations and workplace relations, given the legacy of work choices. It's very hard to break out of that conversation, and we absolutely have to. So really pleased to see the government putting this forward. I think business needs to lean into that conversation. Innovation and collaboration at the workplace is the driver of productivity. And making sure that employees and employers are able to do that well, I think is critical, both to jobs growth and productivity.
And I think aligned to that, the issue of skills is absolutely paramount. Everywhere that I go with CEDA members, people are talking about skills mismatch in the economy. We're going to have a bit of a go at that in terms of our research in the second part of the year, looking at skills mismatch and how that interacts with the permanent migration program. This seems like another one where business really needs to get together with other stakeholders and sort of work through different options to, our formal linear kind of sense of how people develop their skills and their careers. Is that how you're seeing some of the challenges around this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of issues in the skills space. We touched on some of it with our temporary skilled migration work. I think, if anyone who catches a taxi or an Uber is probably sitting there with an anecdote around someone who's driving them who's got some crazy qualification that they're somehow not managing to put into use here in Australia. And then there's all sorts of concerns around the skills that kids are leaving high school with and how we make sure that they're going to have jobs in the future. At the same time as you've got business just crying out for skills and identifying it as a real source of impediment to growth. So we've got to do a better job of this. It's got to involve all sectors. And it's got to be very focused on the sorts of skills and the sort of agility and skills that we need in the future.
And infrastructure has obviously been really important in terms of holding up economic growth recently. I think there's an interesting opportunity in social infrastructure, and it's good to see more people talking about this. And I think it encourages us to think about social infrastructure differently and designing it differently and making sure that we wrap a lot of different aligned services and facilities in particular areas, and certainly seeing a bit of that focus with state governments. Is there an opportunity in infrastructure in 2020, or is it pure challenge in terms of delivering all of these projects that are in the pipeline?
Well, I think it's, obviously people are pretty supportive of the infrastructure spend that's going on in Australia because it has been such an important driver of growth. But it's interesting that around those conversations, you're still seeing so much focus on getting the right pipeline and long-term planning. So next year, delivery of projects is going to be fundamental to sustaining growth and jobs, etc. But longer term, I think the big question is how can we improve our planning of built infrastructure and social infrastructure so that it delivers the outcomes that the community wants. I think sitting alongside this is a big conversation about regions. And what the right investment in infrastructure build in regions is. We've seen a lot of conversation around getting people to move to regions. That's complex, and again, it's going to require serious government stewardship, I think, and the involvement of business.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, and I think there's even a fundamental question sometimes of how we define our regions and what that means in terms of migration program or infrastructure funding and things like that. But
well, just on that, I think it's really fascinating when you look at the migration work and policies that are being introduced, where they've now streamlined this. So it's anything other than Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane is a region. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think a lot of work to be done in the infrastructure space.
So thanks, Melinda. We've covered a lot of territory there, and I'm looking forward to the first big CEDA product of 2020, our economic and political overview, which will cover a lot of the terrain that we've talked about today. And for all the people who are viewing this, I hope you also have a great break over the Christmas period and come back in 2020 energised and ready to take on a lot of these big challenges. Look forward to seeing you then.